Since we are 2 minutes past the hour, I think now is a good time to get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Serena Harrison. I'm the Director of Program Implementation at Build It Green. And before we dive into our topic today, we have a few opening remarks from Build It Green's Executive Director, Jeremy Madsen, followed by Aisha Pamaku from the San Francisco Foundation and the Partnership of the Base Future as one of Build It Green's founding sponsors. So with that, Jeremy, I'm going to pass it to you to take it away.
All right. Thanks, Serena. And I just want to welcome everyone to Hidden Cost, Vital Opportunity, Transforming Housing and Infrastructure. Again, I'm Jeremy Madsen, Executive Director here at Build It Green, or BIG, as we are often called. So we focus on housing in California. And, in some ways that might sound relatively straightforward, but I know that most of you here recognize that housing in California is far from straightforward. We at BIG, we got our start 20 years ago trying to make California homes more green, climate friendly, energy efficient, water efficient. Others, including I suspect many of you, focus on our state's chronic affordability crisis and work to build new homes that are affordable to low and middle income Californians, or to maintain the affordability of existing homes. We still have others who see housing in the context of community development. So we're not just constructing buildings for people to reside in, but neighborhoods in which people can proudly live. And in places that have faced disinvestment and racism, housing and community development have to be intertwined with power building so that those who have been marginalized can lead and benefit from neighborhood change. And then there are those who see housing through an entrepreneurship and career development lens, viewing the construction and rehabilitation of homes as an opportunity to create career path jobs and to fuel small businesses. So too often, these priorities and many others that show up in California's housing space, they end up getting pitted against each other as competing priorities. But I want to say this really clearly: they're not competing priorities. These are interwoven goals that we have to achieve to create the equitable, affordable, environmentally vital California that so many of us yearn for. And that's why at Build It Green, we've turned our focus to holistic strategies that can regeneratively, synergistically, and simultaneously address the multiple issues in California's housing ecosystem. So the event today is inspired by that spirit. How can we address the chronic infrastructure disinvestment in marginalized communities? How can we build more affordable housing? And how can we do both in service to community aspirations of residents who have long been shut out of housing and community development decision-making? And I'm just really excited to hear from our speakers today about these topics. So I am now going to turn it over to Aisha Pamaku from the San Francisco Foundation, one of BIG's founding sponsors. We're dropping a link about our founding sponsor program into the chat. It's a great way to support BIG financially and to be recognized for doing so. And if any of you want to learn about the program, just click on the link. And so Aisha, over to you.
Jeremy, thank you so much. And thank you to the whole Build It Green team for all this amazing programming and for all that you do. We at the San Francisco Foundation are very happy and proud to be partners with you all. Hi, everybody. My name is Aisha Pamaku. I'm the Policy Fund Director at the San Francisco Foundation. For those of you who don't know, we're a community foundation serving the Bay Area, anchored in our values of racial equity and economic inclusion. We believe in a Bay Area where everyone can thrive, and we envision a region where who you are and where you live is no longer a barrier to opportunity. And I'm also part of a cross-sector initiative called the Partnership for the Bay's Future, hosted at the San Francisco Foundation. And we are all about equitable housing solutions in the Bay Area, and we achieve that through moving local policy and also investing deeply in affordable homes. And that's really just what we do, but like many of you, how we do it is just as important. And what we do is really focus on a systems change approach, which you're going to hear about today. And, as Jeremy sketched out, we know the problems quite well, right? We have a housing crisis that is just deepening racial wounds. We've got uneven infrastructure, growing economic inequality. And of course, none of these issues can be separated or solved by itself, right? This isn't a problem that happened by accident, and it certainly didn't happen overnight. It's rooted in interwoven systems that are the result of many times intentional choices and decades of disinvestment and discrimination. And they can't be picked apart because I often return to the quote from Audre Lorde, who said that there's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. And I think that's very much applicable here. And I just want to share with folks, right? Like, I think sometimes it seems daunting when you say, okay, these problems are interwoven systems and these systems are operating at a massive scale. But I don't want it to make us feel stuck, right? The good news is that this offers us opportunity. And there's three opportunities at least that I see that I think could frame this conversation really nicely. And the first is that we have allies everywhere. Because these issues are so interwoven and interconnected, we actually have equity-centered champions in all sectors who are ready and able to partner with us. We just have to find them and figure out how to activate them. And second, we can have a major impact, far more than we could have if we do it alone, by getting to the root causes of things. When we collaborate together, we can actually change the rules of the game, change the rules of the system. And this allows us to work on a massively bigger scale than we could by ourselves. And the final thing I'll say is we can innovate. And I know this is a theme that's really important to BIG, right? Doing things the same way we've always done them is not going to change our systems, but trying new things, finding new collaborators, getting outside of our comfort zone, and really grounding ourselves in our values, that's what's going to change the system. And so that's why we at the San Francisco Foundation and the Partnership for the Bay's Future are so proud to be partners with you all and with Build It Green. When we work together to solve systemic problems, that's when we can have a transformative impact. So I'm also really excited to just sit back and learn today. And thank you all for the opportunity to share some of what we're working on at the San Francisco Foundation and Partnership for the Bay's Future. It's going to be a fabulous conversation today. Thank you, team.
All right, if we can start our slide deck, and I will, yeah, really kick off the conversation today on unlocking housing through equitable infrastructure, hosted by Build It Green and Pre-Collective. Before we begin, we wanted to give a special thanks to our founding sponsor, the San Francisco Foundation, as well as the event co-sponsors, the Council of Infill Builders, Housing Action Coalition, and the Urban Land Institute San Francisco chapter. And now I have the wonderful pleasure of introducing our moderator and panelists for today. So our moderator is Shalini Bashala, Executive Director of Pre-Collective. With over 15 years of experience in designing and financing resilient infrastructure solutions, Shalini is a nationally recognized expert and currently a board member of Smart Growth America and a non-resident senior fellow with the Brookings Institution Metro program. Our first panelist is Justin Smith, founder of Reliquity Enterprises. Justin's extensive experience in real estate investment, development, and construction has created over 1,300 housing units worth over $500 million. His commitment to collaboration, community, and innovative funding strategies shines through in his business soul, his development projects, and several teaching positions that he holds at community colleges throughout the Bay Area. Next, we have Mia Kang, Senior VP of Related California and a co-founding board member of the Council of Infill Builders. Mia is a trailblazer in affordable transit-oriented development with over 20 years experience. Her housing projects have been honored with awards from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, the American Institute of Architects, the U.S. Green Building Council, and the Governor's Environmental and Economic Leadership Award. And to round us out, we have Tom Pace, Director of Community Development from the City of Sacramento. With 27 years of experience in community development and urban planning, Tom has been instrumental in shaping Sacramento's future as a housing-first city, and it's the first city in the state to have its housing element approved. His expertise in emergency shelter planning, flood risk management, and transit-oriented development continues to shape his work. Please give a little virtual applause for all our wonderful speakers who are joining us today. And I'm now going to pass the floor to Shalini to ground in our topic.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much to Jeremy, Serena, and the team at BIG for pulling us all together, and to Aisha for that wonderful framing about challenge as opportunity. So my name is Shalini, as Serena said, and our team at Pre-Collective focuses on all things infrastructure pre-development. And that is the kind of wonky term for all the early messy stuff you have to do to build what you actually need next, instead of just putting band-aids on what you have. And what that means is our team works across a large number of different infrastructure types. And two of those types are water and sewer infrastructure and housing. And we started seeing a problem a few years ago coming from our backgrounds and expertise working in the water sector, where working in environmental justice communities and historically disinvested communities, these are often the spaces where water infrastructure is furthest from a state of good repair. What that means is stuff's falling apart first and worst in these neighborhoods. And those are the pipes under the streets. Oftentimes this reflects decades of disinvestment, like Aisha said in the intro. And the root cause, in some cases, goes back to redlining. And so if you look at these systems, what that means across sectors is you have water systems that take a lot of money to bring up to a state of good repair, to allow new infill. So this means that in the places where infill housing would have the greatest impact and the highest value, there's also the greatest cost hurdle to bringing water and sewer systems up to the level needed to add density, to add capacity. So across the water and the housing sector, what we started seeing from the water side is we were hearing from developers that affordable housing and multi-family projects were being delayed or downsized or stalled because the cost and the effort to upgrade water and sewer systems was so great that it was actually blocking projects. So as we worked through these issues, we called the team at Big, because of course we needed to see it from the other side with their decades of experience on the housing side. And so we really saw where capital planning was disconnected from housing needs. And there was an opportunity here at the intersection of these two sectors. So if you flip to the next slide, yeah, no worries, we'll carry on. So the next slide here, as we were tackling these problems from our different vantage points, from the water sector at Pre-Collective and from the field of housing at Build It Green, we also are at a moment where this is a real opportunity. Just like Aisha said, right? This is a tremendous challenge that these issues are connected, and putting your thumb on one side of the scale really impacts the other. But it's also a huge opportunity. Right now, we are about halfway through two major pieces of federal legislation, funding legislation, where we have a historic amount of money for infrastructure upgrading and repair and climate action, which includes things like infill housing. And so we're at a moment in time where we have the most money since Roosevelt to tackle these issues simultaneously, really once in a generation funding. And so we need to be able to walk and chew gum. And that's what's so exciting about the moment we're in and this conversation, where I'm really looking forward to diving in with Justin and Mia and Tom to talk through how these challenges have played out on the ground in each of their experiences and how they are respectively shaping solutions. So I'm going to pause and turn it to Justin first to share his experience working at the intersection of infrastructure and housing. Take it away, Justin.
Thank you, Shalini. It's very interesting that you bring up this intersection, because you brought up a couple of key points, and that is we're dealing with the situation of disinvested communities. And yes, there's a federal push for dollars in terms of water and sewer in these disinvested communities. But let's get to the heart of the matter in terms of why we have these well, not necessarily why, because you mentioned that in terms of red line communities, but it's not just water and sewer. It's things like energy and electric. It's things like fiber and connectivity. It's things like hazmat conditions. It's things like building inventory, land inventory, and distressed land and distressed buildings and warehouse buildings, because Because really what Redline has created, it basically put a line around an entire community and shoved everything inside a paper bag and said, make it work. And shoved people inside that incubator or in that environment and said, you make it work and don't get outside of it. And for years and years, you know, we've made it work, right? But now there's a strain. There's a strain on the system. You see homeless, you see affordable issues. And so the projects that we deliver really are almost an effect of this cause. And so, you know, the projects that we deliver are usually projects that are workforce housing projects. You know, a lot of the resume that she mentioned are student housing projects. And now we even having this intersection between workforce housing, middle market housing, and affordable housing, and homeless housing, and as well as and it's all coming together. So our goal and the projects that we do back in the 90s, you know, I'll talk about project sort of models. There was a project, we pick up a project and it would be debt and equity, you know, and you just figure it out and make it happen. And you would go at risk and so on and so forth. Nowadays, and so that's really, I'll call it the 90s model. But, you know, talk about the 2024 and beyond model, you know, it's, you know, I'll check the boxes. Yes, you need debt. You will likely need equity. But more importantly, you will need a public subsidy or some type of public good. And then I think you even need a fourth piece. You need some type of operational economics. You know, when you're doing some of these projects, you may say, hey, okay, we're just doing a project for a workforce, or we're doing a project for assisted living or senior and what have you. But now you need a services component. So many developers are saying, well, where's that services component? So that's where the operational economics come into. You can't just, you know, say a developer, hey, go out and do, you know, 50% AMI or 80% AMI project, and you're serving a disadvantaged population without there being some public agency that brings some level of support for that community. Because remember, our communities were not built overnight. We had multiple layers. It was like vanilla ice cream, you know, we had multiple layers, right? And so as we go to build and develop these communities, we need to make sure that we have a public good, we have multiple layers, and we have support networks and systems. So many of the projects, whether we're doing a project in a city like Berkeley, you know, where there may be some form of 80% AMI, there may be a middle market component. There also may be a student component. We're also aligning with, you know, the city and some of their programs, and a civic solution like Equity for Black Berkeley and so on. So really, you really have to recreate the community in these new development models. And that's what we're doing in cities like Oakland. We're also branching out into other areas, and really, it's almost like we're creating the city on a development. So you do 120 unit development, yes, you're going to need to have varying levels of people, various stratas of income, and so on and so forth. So that's what we're seeing, and that's been my current experience, sort of putting these type of deals together. Is like every development is like a mini city, whereas before it was like, you know, you find a site, 2 acres, you put 50, 100 units or so on and so forth, walk away, you know, everybody's done. No, it's a little bit more complex because of the circumstances that we've created, whether as a community, whether as a government, or so on. But we can't look back, but we do have to look back for solutions and look forward for progress, look forward for working together, and we're looking forward to making sure that we hold each other accountable. So as a developer, that's what I would say that we have to do in these new days.
That was fantastic, Justin. And I love the reframe from what a housing developer's role used to be to these new creators of pocket cities through integrated housing developments. And I think what I really appreciated in how you just broke this down is oftentimes we'll hear a lot of conversations about, you know, the capital stack or all the colors of money you need to get a project done. And I think you laid out a really lovely vision of the value stack that needs to be created by housing in the
That's
fabric of all these other systems to repair some of the harms that were embedded in our urban fabric. So
that's right.
I really appreciate that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I just want to, and you have to think of it from a value stack perspective, because, you know, a developer or several developers will not create a city overnight. And most of us developers that are on the line know that overnight is like 3 years. But nevertheless, we're not going to create it overnight. And the other thing is we have to hold not only ourselves accountable, our community accountable, the civic groups accountable, and we also have to hold the federal government accountable. And it sounds like, based on your intro, they're starting to stand up and say, okay, water and sewer play a part. Well, there are other agencies out there, DTSC play a part. Department of Transportation. They at many communities were either destroyed, impacted, or changed due to transportation systems, in our inner cities. Now it's 2024. Do your part, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So we're going to get to that in the second half of this, but I so appreciate how you set the tone on the value stack here. So I'm going to ask Mia now to chime in with her experiences on how infrastructure and housing come together. So Mia, floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for remarks, Justin. Good framing, and to Big and to the San Francisco Foundation. It's a great conversation to have. And I will say that as a developer, I've been exclusively building in the infill space. Early on, even before SB 375 was law, there was a lot of programs around affordable housing that really did incentivize infill development, along with the fact that these areas were areas in existing communities that were close to existing amenities, things like grocery stores, parks, transit, you name it. And those were the great opportunity areas. So all the policy folks said, this is where we want to invest our money, in these very, similar to what Justin was saying, in these very disenfranchised community, high poverty census tract. We call those QCTs, difficult to develop areas. And so it really drove a lot of the affordable housing work that I did, and I've been building affordable housing for the last 25 years, into these infill areas. And so one of the things that we've, early on in my career, I started building about 25 years ago. And during that time, we all in California were very familiar with the word redevelopment and redevelopment agencies. Since redevelopment was started in 1945, before the majority of us were born. So in many cases, it was just sort of norm. We just expected it. And guess what? Redevelopment agencies funded a lot of that infill infrastructure. Because, oh, by the way, these are also the areas that were opportunity. They were also the areas that were blighted. These were also the areas that were locally low income. And those were also the areas that happened to be Black and brown in many cases. So you had this great opportunity with redevelopment that allowed, since 1945, which was about 67 years, the ability to invest through the public private partnership model. We call it P3, everyone's familiar with that, where local government says, here's my agenda, here's my value proposition. I want to see affordable housing, I want to see infrastructure, and I want to see job development. So that was a big driver of redevelopment. In 2012, redevelopment agencies ceased to exist in California, period, gone. You've also, I would imagine, if anyone ever did the math, I think you would start to see what happened is we had a lot of old successor agency projects. So it was a huge boom. Redevelopment produced $1 billion a year in affordable housing subsidy, period, on the year it closed. We've lost that. It's never come back. We've had things like EIFDs, but they do not deliver the same kind of punch, money, or value system. The other thing that we have as a challenge, because I was asked to talk about challenges at this moment, is that we also have Prop 13. So in 1978, Prop 13 was passed, which allowed for homeowners to enjoy really predictable taxes, but at the same time, it allowed for local governments to realize that they don't have enough money to fund infrastructure. So then models sort of flipped. And so what happened is local government said, you know what, housing, we want to see jobs in retail because that gives us the best tax base. Sales tax is easy, property tax is easy. But when it comes to developing housing, housing doesn't always pay for itself because you have lots of people, you have more costs on schools, more costs on public services. And so it's a lot easier for some smaller community to say, we don't want any more housing because we don't only have so many firefighters. We can't afford any more people because we only have so many firefighters, and that's the budget, right? So then they can say no to housing. So, your alignments, and one of the biggest challenges, and I think, was outlined earlier, is we have this opportunity where all this federal money is coming in, but guess what? None of it's aligned, right? Because every entity has its own agenda. And those agendas don't align necessarily with fund all this and infrastructure in infill areas. Like, for example, if you talk to a water person, you probably have 10 different ideas for how to spend that federal money. Let's build some reserves underneath. Let's build some giant tanks to have all this farm irrigation water. So we'll have thousands of whatever you measurements, yard acres or some water measurement, feet acres of water, or let's desalinate Santa Barbara so that we can have clean. So there's lots of ideas, right? So how do you bring all these together? How do we all then decide what's the priority? What's the value system that we can all agree to? Well, I think everyone knows that housing, we are in a crisis, right? And I think if you think about the combined Prop 13, which doesn't fund enough to do preventative infrastructure, we also have, gone or redevelopment. But the one thing we have seen that has been very, very successful in California since I didn't get the date, but since the Melrose tax happened, we see a lot of what we call sprawl. We see a lot of planned communities, gated communities, call them what you may. They have a clubhouse, they might have a school, they may have 3,000 beautiful homes that are all very similar, and they're great, and they appreciate and value, and they're safe, but they're all built with what's called a Melrose, and a Melrose is a bond, and it allows for that builder to pay for what they need today, which is build the roads, build the infrastructure, do all that by borrowing against what the future homeowners will pay in an assessed increased value. So there's a Melrose tax that goes on top of your Prop 13 tax, on top of your supplemental tax, that specifically goes to pay for whatever the builder put in first. That water, that sewer, that lighting, that sidewalk, that clubhouse, all gets paid by every homeowner for the next, however many years it is, 50 years, 30 years. And so in that way, that is how we have so many communities built in the middle of nothing, right? Because they have a financing tool that allows them to finance this really critical infrastructure, which, by the way, infrastructure doesn't turn a profit. If someone just puts in a little bit of infrastructure, there's no money, right? So in the way that it works now in the infill world, if you are a builder and you are the first person in this community to do the first townhome, on that parking lot that was nothing but a parking lot before it was a Dairy Queen, guess what? That infrastructure isn't there. So if you are the first project to do 20 units and you've got to increase a sewer line that now cost you $2 million, your deal no longer pencils.
Mia, I so appreciate how as Justin laid out this value stack, you kind of brought us to how we got in this handbasket that we're in now for housing in California. And also where in some ways we have made the hardest thing, infill, harder relative to other things that we need to do. And that creates
and not only that,
disparity.
Prioritize it. So we streamlined it. So we now make it so, frankly, there's so many tools to get these projects approved. And now there's no way to fund them.
Yeah. So I think this is an incredibly compelling pair of things that you and Justin have laid out in terms of the problem. So I'm going to ask you each for just a 1 minute street address specific example, because you've laid out kind of the big picture of how we got here from redlining to the death of redevelopment. But can you give a street address specific example of how this has played out in your own development work, where you've just seen a project get stuck or not turn out the way you'd hoped, and what that looks like? Because I think we have a lot of folks. In my work in infrastructure, we often use the Yogi Berra quote, in theory, there's no difference between theory and practice, but in practice there is. And so really getting down to the fact that you all are practitioners. Success looks like moving money and shovels to communities that really need it. Where has that success been squeezed by some of the things you've laid out big picture? And what does that mean for people? Justin, can I turn it to you to start? Just like a 30-second, what does this look like for an individual?
Yeah, what this looks like, I like to highlight a project that we're working on, actually in the city of Berkeley. It doesn't fit the model, but it's affected by all the things that are in the industry that for housing, but it is 100% It's 100% permanently affordable homeownership project. It's in the heart of Berkeley, urban infill. It doesn't need the infrastructure. So we've looked at the inequities and said, okay, let's play a part in terms of aligning with the equities. So transportation is right there on the AC Transit bus line. It's also on Shattuck Avenue, so it's in a path of progress, and there's a lot of housing and a lot of development coming that way. So that's a fortunate thing, because also you know that the builders are there, so the cost of construction is very high. But given the fact that it's in that path of progress, you can benefit from that. It's a mass timber CLT project, so it's a heavy ESG mission based project. It's enhanced passive house. It has battery backup. It has some other super fancy water-based systems. It has which are borrowed from Sweden, because they're advancing that. It also has a solar PV array for collecting energy. I feel like you can even eat the paint on the wall, but it's a very tough project. I mean, like super ESG,
don't tell my
right?
4-year-old that.
Right, I won't tell. Keep your children away from the walls. No, but with this type of project, it is very much a challenge to do. Not necessarily all because of just the challenges around infrastructure, although we do have them from an energy grid and electric perspective, because everything is going electric, and you got to upgrade a lot of different things, which is one of those hidden infrastructure issues that a developer faces. But this particular project struggles also because it is home ownership. I mean, can anybody raise their hand and say they've seen a home ownership project in an urban infill location with public subsidy that is not ASIC grant, IIG, or any of the grant sources? Well, we were not competitive in terms of those numbers, in terms of receiving those funds. So we're this outlier. But I'm bringing. I know we're here talking about equitable infrastructure, but also home ownership is also this outlier, which shouldn't be an outlier. Like it's still last time I checked, it's the best way to raise, not raise, but to build generational wealth in this country. That hasn't changed, right? So that's an example of a project that is a mixed bag of how do we do it? How do we get this done? And so on. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's at the heart of an urban infill project that we're desperately trying to get done, get funded. But it has its challenges.
I really appreciate that as the kind of thing we're going to hold on to through the rest of this conversation, and as we talk about bigger solutions, because those are the outcomes we're trying to see, Justin, and picking apart the barriers to get there. Mia, do you have a short specific example, or would you like to hold to talk about RISE at the end?
I just want to give you a quick one. I want to tell you about, you asked me for a street address. So I wanted to give one in Sacramento at 429 12th Street, because it's built. It was built 12 years
Love
ago.
it.
It's called La
Fantastic.
Valentina. Sorry. It's called La Valentina, and I worked with Tom Pace in the city of Sacramento. It was super challenging. This was when we had redevelopment. It was a dirty site. It was a gas station owned by the redevelopment agency for 25 years, 3 failed attempts at development. Redevelopment agency chose my team. This was about 14 years ago. And we had to change every zoning, we had about 20 special permits and variances. We had a 16-month process. We had hearing after hearing after hearing. We had neighbors that were upset. We had people crying regularly at meetings. It took an act of God in many cases to get things done, but we were able to win everyone's support. We also dealt with, this was during the Obama administration, and we had the mortgage meltdown. So like the world fell out from underneath all the banks. We were right in the middle of our project. We needed to get enough funding to pull it through. We were able to secure grants. This is the kind of project where everybody came together who needed to come together. And that is why it happens. And that is why I think affordable housing in the infill world, when your problems are big, you bring everybody to the table. And when everybody comes to the table, you can solve big things. And so as a result, The project won numerous awards. This was an old historic park, the Alkali Flat neighborhood. It was the oldest residential neighborhood in all of Sacramento that's been continuing for over 100 years. The infrastructure was 67 years old. We had to put in brand new transformer lines. We had to drop major transformers underneath an active train. We had to do all kinds. It was the very first TOD ever built in Sacramento, 100% affordable. It absolutely then changed the transit patterns. Transit went up in this area. It was also high crime. Crime went down in this area, and it created walkability, and it created opportunities for millennials to move in and then walk to their state jobs because it was so close. So I think it is a story to tell that it is onerous, it is hard, and you have to plan for it, and you got to work really hard, but you got to bring partners to the table. And I think when you can bring partners to the table, you can really deliver.
That was a tremendous pairing of examples and also call to actions. I mean, I want to give you the shout out that's in chat of we need more of this. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about next with Tom, and then to pass it back to me and Justin. So Tom, I'm going to give a 30-second intro to what I hope you'll be able to dive deep on and connect directly to what Mia just said, which is we have an opportunity to do this right. There are champions in this space who have a very high pain threshold and endurance for being able to do this work, as Mia just described. And getting it right means actually zooming out and thinking bigger to open up solutions rather than trying to make things smaller. And so with that, can I hand it to you, Tom, and ask Alex to reshare from Tom's first slide?
Yes, thank you very much, Shalini, and really inspiring to hear the examples from Justin and Mia as well. And I want to kind of build on that, those comments that Mia just shared about the La Valentina project in Sacramento. The city of Sacramento, I think for at least 20, maybe 25 years, has had a stated goal of promoting infill development, minimizing sprawl, revitalizing blighted communities, supporting transit-oriented development. And we've had to learn through trial and error how to do that. There weren't a lot of great models for cities to follow in North America. And so, we have learned. And I think that the La Valentina project was one of the last in a long string of projects that we looked at that we wanted to support, that we thought were great projects, that were the kind of thing that the city wanted to see happen in the community. But every single one of them was such a terrible struggle, a struggle for the developer, but also a struggle for city staff. I mean, we said it's something that we want, and yet our systems and processes and plans and regulations and funding mechanisms were not aligned to facilitate this type of development. And so I think that just unfortunately, shortly after Mia went through all of that pain, we were in a place, we had the right time and the right people and the right alignment to really begin to make a change in the way that we do our planning and zoning in the city of Sacramento. And so we made a lot of changes after that project that would now allow that type of project with much greater ease in terms of the planning and zoning. So I do want to say, first of all, it's important that that there be good planning in place. Communities need to plan for infill development. And unfortunately, we still see, a lot of cases where the planning in many places throughout this country and here in California the planning does not support infill development and the increase of infill housing development in particular. Let's see, why don't we try going to the next slide? See if, yeah, there we go. And so moving from the importance of having the right planning and zoning in place, we then began to see that infrastructure is also a serious impediment. So you can have perfect zoning, you could have a quick, easy permit process to get a project approved. But as Mia was saying, it's still difficult to actually get the project built. And a lot of that is financing related, but tied in with that is the infrastructure problem. What we found is that in many of these older areas, that we had targeted for infill development, not much development had happened in many decades, and there wasn't a lot known about the state of the infrastructure. And so we would routinely place a condition of approval on developers' projects that would say, hey, you need to do a water study, you need to do a sewer study, you need to do a drainage study, find out what the capacity is in the existing system. And then if it's not adequate for your project, design the upgrades required and then build those upgrades. So you have a lot of unknowns here. First of all, you don't even know if the infrastructure is adequate. You don't know what it's going to take to fix it. You don't know how much that's going to cost, and you don't know how long it's going to take. And all of it was too much time, too much money, too much uncertainty, not a real big help to facilitating infill development. So the city recognized this, and we started doing infrastructure studies in key areas that had been identified for infill. And we would go into a defined area and we'd look at what our general plan says, and we'd actually hire engineers instead of making developers do this on a project by project basis. We'd hire engineers to look at the whole area and say, okay, we have this much development planned in this area, and we have this much for each of these vacant lots or these underutilized lots. What is it going to take to serve that? And we'd get the answer. And then we would put in place an infrastructure plan. We'd identify funding mechanisms. It doesn't necessarily mean that we had money. A funding mechanism is not the same as money, but at least, we had a start. And so maybe we can go to the next slide. The funding piece is something that I'm really excited about because we have in the Sacramento region, we have the Sacramento Area Council of Governments, which is our metropolitan planning organization, and they created a program called Green Means Go. They recognized the need for this type of infrastructure. Traditionally, the state and federal governments have funded transportation infrastructure and neglected water, sewer, and drainage infrastructure. And so Green Means Go is really oriented to that additional water, sewer, and drainage infrastructure that is not traditionally funded by our metropolitan planning organizations. And so SACOG came up with this program, asked all the cities and counties in their region to submit green zones, which are areas that basically meet the type of infill development that we want to see, and give projects that are needed to get those areas going. So we were ready. We had done a number of studies. We submitted our green zones. We submitted our project list. And we have millions of dollars worth of funding identified in REAP 2.0. And this is a state funding program that will provide funding to SACOG, who will then provide it to the city of Sacramento in order to complete some key projects. These are 3 examples on the screen. The Del Paso area sewer improvements, Lavender Heights water infrastructure, and the River District drainage pumping. And these improvements, when they are constructed, will enable over 3,500 housing units to be constructed. We're just crossing our fingers right now that the state budget will be passed very soon without big dents in the REAP 2.0 program. It's looking promising. We don't know yet the outcome of that. But if that funding comes through, we are ready to go. We've got these projects designed. And if you go to the next slide, I can just show you what a few of them look like. So this is the one on Del Paso Boulevard, and we'll go to the next one. This one's in Lavender Heights, and the third one, this one's in the River District. So we have several different projects. We have actually more than these, but I just thought I'd give you some real examples of projects that are designed, waiting for this infrastructure funding to come through. And so what I would advocate for is that communities throughout the state, align their planning with these infill development goals that are important for our climate, for our affordable housing, for supporting existing transit systems where those are in place, and also then do the work on getting the infrastructure planned, removing those unknowns for developers so that it's now known that either there is adequate infrastructure, or if there isn't, what it's going to take to get there. And then ideally try to get that funding in place and actually build the infrastructure so that now developers are not burdened with, all of those unknowns, and not perhaps even burdened with the costs of having to deal with those things, because many of these projects have affordable components. And obviously, you know, if you add infrastructure costs to an affordable housing project, it just makes it that much harder to do. So I think I'll stop there.
That was great, Tom. And I love how you separated out the difference between what is a market failure around housing and what is a failure of enabling conditions, which
I
is
would call it a
actually a shared thing.
planning
Yeah.
failure, you know?
No,
Yeah.
that's near and dear to my heart as a former EPA official, where we watched some towns find water mains when they broke. And you found yourself with a 200-year-old wood water main somewhere that you were trying to deal with. I think reducing these unknowns is a huge thing, but also recognizing that these enabling conditions and the planning that's required for them takes real upfront thought. You know, what are all the things you're trying to do, and how do we make this possible for developers to succeed in the places where we want to see communities thrive? And so I want to turn it over to Mia, and I'm going to ask you to pack this into 2 minutes so we have time for questions from the audience, the participants. Can you share a little bit about RISE and build on kind of what Tom shared on what's optimistic and what's happening?
Excellent. Thank you. Yes, I will speak quickly. Thank you. So a bill that the Council of Infill Builders is one of the bill sponsors of is called RISE, AB 930. It's currently an active bill. The author is Assemblymember Laura Friedman out of Glendale. She was the former mayor of Glendale, had very real experience with, you know, infrastructure, affordable housing, and the challenges that it takes to kind of move, you know, a suburban community, frankly, into a little bit more of an urban area. And she really saw a lot of the challenges around infrastructure. And she also spent a lot of time in Japan and saw, like in Tokyo, or in, you know, you have these incredible train stations that have everything. And part of the reason why these train stations work so well in Japan, like they operate, you know, they're on time, they're clean, they have housing, they have services, they have, you can buy things, is because everything's combined. So in other words, your tax revenue, your support, everything goes to sort of help the transit system, help the infrastructure, and help the operations. And so with that notion, Assemblymember Laura Friedman and myself came together to really think about a way to come up with an infrastructure proposal. So this is actually something I've been working on since redevelopment died. So AB 930 is called Reinvestment in Infrastructure for a Sustainable and Equitable California. What it does is it sets up the premise so that two local governments, they can be city, county, transit agency, housing authority, or a special district, can come together and form a tax increment district that could unlock tax increment financing for infrastructure and equitable development. Granted, because redevelopment end, we don't have the state share of tax, property tax increment. It's going to be the local share of property tax increment, sales tax increment, TOT tax, any other fee. So it adds for a variety of more sources that can go into the tax increment. And what it also does is it relies and it will align all that Tom talked about, that planning and infrastructure work, that vital work that also the MPOs under SB 375 worked on, right? They're called sustainable community strategies, whereas as a state, we've all adopted these policies of sort of moving people closer to jobs and services and transit, get people out of their cars, will absolutely reduce the amount of vehicle miles traveled. So under that rubric, RISE will align planning and infrastructure investments to refocus growth towards community centers while reducing car independence, lower carbon emissions, and encourage economic development and climate resilient housing. For that, if districts form, they can be EIFD districts, any existing TIF district can become a RISE district. OPR will provide guidance, and then it also provides a revolving loan fund. So the biggest difference, this out of any other tool that's out there, is that we are setting up an enabling revolving loan fund. It will not be funded this year, but the premise will be. So that means that any RISE district that goes to the state IBank and asks for a loan can get a loan. Talk about equity, right? So it's not like compete. So then the goal is to be state aligned with state planning goals around climate, where we're going to have our investments, do aligned infrastructure. 50% of the money has to be spent on infrastructure, 30% has to be spent on affordable housing. Sets up affordable housing revenue source, infrastructure revenue source, and a loan program that will revolve and continue to be funded into the future.
Love it, Mia. That was 2 minutes on the nose, and it was a brilliant encapsulation of trying to do everything everywhere all at once. So if I could actually get all the panelists on the screen so we can move to Q&A. I'm gonna I'm going to take the moderator's privilege here to share an experience I had from the federal level working on revolving loan funds for the Environmental Protection Agency. And I think what you all are describing is very much what folks in the federal government are trying to enable very hard from inside their own silos right now. Mia, you pointed this out of all these different colors of federal money. Being able to stitch together what a good outcome looks like on the ground. So the links that you all shared in the chat, Tom, the images you showed on your slides, we know what success looks like when we see it. We also know what it looks like when it doesn't happen. And one of the things I'm most curious about is, as a water person in a housing conversation, when we talk about revolving loan funds, the EPA has a revolving loan fund for water and infrastructure. And often it's only water people who know how to apply. So you have to do the English to English translation to make this money visible and available in the housing sector. I'm very curious if all of you can just start off with a very quick, this is almost like a lightning round question. Where do you think that English to English translation needs to happen most? Because Mia, I see you doing it through RISE, forcing everyone into a common language. Is that your answer?
Yes, that is my answer. And that we take that federal money, that's water, that's stormwater, that's energy, that's climate, and it all comes together because every single solution is going to be different for every single community. So it isn't a one size fits all, but if it comes up from the grassroots and you identify water in Fresno is our problem, or water on the coast is our problem, how do you then, the other thing I want to also say is, impact fees and impacts to infrastructure is only ever seen in one way. Through the eyes of one unit, right? One unit of a house, which is like 4,000 square feet. Whereas a team, I'm building units right now. I'm doing a tiny home community that are 70 square feet a piece. Instead of 70 square feet, have to pay the same as a 3,000 square foot house for a water hookup, right? So we've got to change our metrics, or we find a way to say, you know what, we're going to change our, and then also water recycling. We don't do anything around purple pipes. Yet everybody, like, the next time we hit a big water shortage, we're all going to go back to purple pipes and coming back to like, how are we going to recycle water? But there isn't a strategy around gray water, right? And there's no incentive around gray water. There's still the ick factor around gray water. So you got to get, if everyone starts to align with a carrot, not a stick, how does every local community rise to these challenges? And what are their unique ways to solve them?
Yeah, I mean, from my former role at EPA, I found myself often hitting people with carrots rather than sticks. So, Tom, that might be a good segue to you.
I think, one thing that we haven't talked about, we didn't talk about Prop 13, but we didn't talk about Prop 218. And this is another voter-approved law that limits the ability of utility agencies to subsidize new growth and development. Basically, ratepayer money can only be used to maintain and operate utility systems for existing ratepayers. So if the federal government has a loan to build new infrastructure, the ratepayers can't repay that loan. So there has to be another way for that loan to be repaid. And it's problematic. I think that it's it's not the case with electricity. It's not the case with certain other things, but it is the case for water for sure. And I think it's an impediment really to being able to get the capital that we need to install these facilities that, in the old days, the local governments could just raise taxes or raise utility rates and put in water lines to serve new development. That's not the case anymore. So it's a challenge.
Justin, please.
Well, I'm not as deeply rooted in the ABs and the propositions and so on and so forth. But to your question, how do we simplify the English and pass this message around? Personally, I think it's through community organizations. I think it's through what Jeremy is doing at Build It Green. I think it's what UC San Francisco Foundation. I think it's through podcasts. I think it's through collective conversations. I'm president of an organization called African American Real Estate Professionals, and we're having these conversations in alignment with Black Developer Forum. We're having these conversations around how do we put heads on beds, because at the end of the day, that's what we're trying to do. And so we're trying to use every lever, every tool that's out there. I mentioned the project that we have on Shattuck Avenue, actually called Woolsey Gardens, but we use SB 35 as a mechanism to get our entitlements. We're looking at other different funding streams. I have projects that are looking at EPA funding, which we haven't mentioned much, but that's another agency that needs to play a part because the federal government played a part in damaging the soil that are beneath many of our buildings and structures. So how do we get the English, how do we make this a household conversation? We keep talking about it. We have these type of conversations. We give some time and some lunch talks and some fire talks and fireside chats to really starting to make this message known and let people know what Tom mentioned, that Prop 218 out there and RISE and AB 930 and other things are out there. So we have to make the conversation more commonplace and more practical.
I love all three of your contributions to this specific point, because I think what you're doing is making visible that infill and dealing with these infrastructure issues is hard, but it is possible. And the rewards are great for the communities we're trying to serve when you do this right. And Tom, with intentionality around the early stage planning, right? And I think, Tom, you said this in your answer to my last question, but I'm gonna tie this to a question in the chat, which is a lot of the biggest challenges around housing and infrastructure upgrading that I see is that the constituency for what's next isn't there now, right? The folks who are in the current environment are not the constituency for what needs to be built for the folks who need to come in. And so when we think about doing this right, when we think about serving future generations, there's a question in the chat here that talks about the possibility of really intentional development that is off-grid, more green, and it flags it to rural or suburban areas. But I'd love if you all could talk about this in the context of kind of the whole sweep of development possibilities of what can we do intentionally that is also more freestanding to serve people who aren't in the system now.
Well, I think that's an interesting question because off-grid, and I don't have a lot of experience with the off-grid communities, but with the cost of infrastructure and the need to distribute that infrastructure to those off-grid locations does present a challenge. Let's just keep it real. It does present a challenge. Can it happen? Yes. Have we had prior civilizations in areas and so on that have that? Yeah. Yes. So where can things like solar energy? Where can self-sustainable communities? Where can we look to the communities that have already done this type of thing? And maybe some of it is, maybe some of it's not on the West Coast. Maybe it's not in California. Maybe it's in other, international locations. So I do think that to do that, we might have to think differently because we're moving towards a more mesh or integrated society in terms of infrastructure and systems. And so that question seems to address, how do we kind of step back? But it's a very interesting and possibly complex. And it's almost like saying, how can I live 6 months without my cell phone?
I think in that context, I wanted to push on this question because I, from the infrastructure side, had a very different reaction to it than I knew you all would have from the housing side. So just hearing you, Justin, was super helpful. And Tom, I'm going to read out what you put in chat, which is, the state planning process doesn't facilitate rural and suburban development because it could enable sprawl. And that's against the outcomes we're trying to go for resilience and sustainability. In the infrastructure space, when I hear the term off-grid, I hear it slightly differently. It's not the cabin in the woods that's freestanding. I actually hear it as resilient to things like power outages or water system outages. And that is a different relationship where you can come at this from a space of climate resilience and have things very tightly tied to the urban fabric. And this is where I'm very optimistic about three different things that are happening in both the water and the electricity sector, which are ways of connecting people physically, like microgrids within a larger grid, which is a different way of thinking about it. Financially connecting folks through things like community solar for example, where you can get renters subscribing to lower cost utilities and enable housing affordability at the operating level, Justin, going back to your comments of you're providing services now, not just units, or things like virtual power plants. And so I actually would push back on the sense of disconnecting things to thinking about new ways to connect folks that provide more resilience, more backup, more redundancy, and more alternatives for the folks who might be in the most financially precarious positions. So with that kind of framing from both the housing and the infrastructure side, I'm going to read out another question from the chat. And I'm going to encourage folks to pop in any last questions into the chat while we respond to this one. So this is from Ryan, forgive me, Van Zoylen, if I've pronounced your name correctly. For federal and limited state funds that are available now, what opportunities are there to reimburse local governments that are funding new infrastructure in communities that need it? And will federal funds go to states for existing and new programs, for example, like RISE? Mia, could you start on that one?
Sure. I will say that I don't personally know of any programs that will already that will reimburse the city for investing, but I will say, and I think you're from San Francisco, Ryan, you know, clearly the biggest opportunity for cities to invest in infrastructure, if you're building affordable housing, is to leverage then those dollars of investment as part of your cost, part of your capital stack. So that's, you know, and that clearly shows then the state that the city and the locals are behind this project because they are front loading it with infrastructure. So I think it shows intentionality and it shows commitment. The way I think RISE is going to work is that, you know, the hope is that, you know, the state every year, as Shalini talked about, will get, you know, billions of dollars of state funding for water, for climate, for blah, 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 blah. And then it's the state budget guys, you know, that decide how to slice up that money and what to give it to. You know, our hope then is maybe a part of this money goes to the revolving fund, in which then each locality that has the challenges with water, sewer, because they're not gonna have one singular challenge. You're gonna have a lot of challenges. It's gonna be water and sewer and electrical, right? So you kind of need to pull money from all the different buckets. And maybe it all kind of falls under climate, right? But then climate can only go so far. The other thing that I think is really important is that, again, the challenge with infill, and I think Tom raised the issue about 218, you know, cities and utility companies cannot pay it forward. They cannot invest their dollars into this infrastructure that's going to make way for all this new housing. So there needs to be a way, though, to have sensible planning around the kind of infrastructure that's needed to unlock the development potential in all of the privately owned sites and publicly owned sites, right? Because a lot of times publics just, in some cases, just kind of care about, oh, which sites are going to be affordable housing in Reno or whatever. It's like, you got to think about everybody's site, right? Especially those, and I think there's a lot of really wonderful opportunities for these sites that are owned by like living trusts, for example, you know, where maybe you have, you know, the heirs of, you know, 10 children that not sure what to do, but now it has a capacity for 500 new units of housing. So how do you get them to the table, right? Because if that infrastructure problem gets solved, then that unlocks the potential. And then going back to Ryan, that's how the city gets paid back. Right?
That's right.
So in other words, it's the long-term investment. So if they put that investment in now, what they're going to get back then is maybe new homes that Justin's going to build, maybe new apartments, and all of those are going to kick off new tax revenues that are all going to go back to the city. So look at it that way, and that's how you get paid back.
Yeah, and I think, Mia, I like what you did there, which is like splitting out there is a nuance, like reimbursing funding is really hard, but preparing buckets to receive funding to enable this work is possible. And those
then
are two different
together,
things.
because it's going to take a braided approach. It's not it's not just one trough of money that's going to solve this problem.
That's
No, exactly right. Justin, please.
No, I was just going to add, we're working on a project which we originally started looking at a project and it sat in one area, but then when we were going to name the project and its approach just for that project, but then we started to identify there's a corridor. So we looked at sort of 3 or 4 different blocks, and then they were looking for transportation dollars. So from the federal department, there's transportation dollars. There's some program called Thriving Communities, right? Yep. And so the concept of that is bringing dollars into not just one project. So to Mina's point, yeah, projects, I mean, dollars may not flow into one particular project, but they may flow into a corridor, which then helps the city, because the city may not have the dollars to fix 5 or 6 or 7 different blocks, because we know, underground, it's a whole, a mesh of different, systems. So if you kind of look at things from a large perspective, use those federal dollars to put into that larger footprint. Yes, that project does benefit, but then 3, 4, 5 blocks benefit as well. Again, getting back to my earlier point, we as developers have to look at projects and say, does the project have a public good? And does the public good align with the city and the civic's public good? And those things have to align. We can't just say, I'm going to get, an acre and put up 500 units and just call it a day. No, it's not going to happen. That's the past.
I think this has been a through line for this entire conversation, which is because you all are trying to solve real and actual hard problems on the ground, you're zooming out to look for those solutions and making the problem bigger. And that is really counterintuitive. Most folks will try to make the problem smaller to be solvable. So I want to call that out and applaud all 3 of you for doing it in your various portfolios of work. Tom, anything you'd add on that?
No, I think that captured it really well. And yeah, I'm excited about the prospect of some type of state or federal funding that would replace, that redevelopment mechanism that formerly existed as a tool really to fund infrastructure. And I mean, and I'm using redevelopment in the way that Mia was referring to it too, is the positive and maybe more modern form of redevelopment, as opposed to the negative form of redevelopment, which unfortunately the city of Sacramento had a role in pioneering in a very bad way for communities that were underrepresented politically. And but I think that we can fix some of that. We have a chance to reverse the damage if we can find the funding to build these communities back the way they should be.
Build better. Sorry.
Yeah, exactly. No, that was a good.
And build it green.
I've heard that messaging somewhere, but I think this goes right back to, this is a lovely full circle moment to Jeremy and Aisha's opening comments, which is the importance of experimentation, right? We are not going to get everything right. We're not going to get it the first time, but if we don't try it, we know for sure we're not going to get it right? We're going to end up with a version of the status quo that none of us know, that all of us know isn't going to work going forward. And so I think there is a tremendous opportunity here. And I'm going to go to Ryan and Oscar's comments in the chat to just share one link before I hand it back to Serena, which is there is a lot of money available right now. It is not easy to get, but the next 3 years of federal funding will shape the next 20 to 30 years of our infrastructure. And that infrastructure needs to be housing enabling, not with heads down in our former silos, thinking about energy and water and transportation as separate things. And so I actually come to this conversation with a great deal of optimism, because just in the last 2 months, the EPA announced $27 billion worth of funding. So just for perspective, when I was at the EPA in 2012, our budget, the whole agency's national budget was $18 billion. And now in one grant program, through 3 different channels, there are $27 billion available for climate smart and equitable development. And this money is being pushed out through community development finance institutions, through national and regional green banks. And I think this is going to be an entirely new source of opportunity that we all need to get organized around and smart about, but it only works for multi-benefit projects. So in some ways, this is an advantage for everyone on this call and what you've heard from all of our panelists, which is we need to think about what we're actually trying to build and for whom, and then solve the problems that are in the way of that and get the structural barriers out of the way. In the absence of that, we won't solve the problems that are worth solving. And so I think that is a lovely return to Aisha's 3 areas of opportunity, which were that we have allies everywhere and champions that we can activate. If we address root causes, we actually have a chance at reaching scale. And in order to innovate, we need to stretch our fingertips out toward one another. So I want to thank all of our panelists for stretching your fingertips toward me and each other, and pass it back to Serena and the team at Build It Green to close us out.
Great. Thanks so much, Shalini and all. I hate following up with Shalini because I feel like you articulate things so well, but really, just to reiterate the journey of the conversation today. You know, we started with the recognizing the need for systems change and innovative collaborative approaches, both from Jeremy and Aisha. And then we grounded in existing historical barriers in the housing space, from redlining to Melrose policies in California. And recognizing, you know, in the different developments that we see vital folks working in, there is an intersection of different housing needs trying to be addressed and still meeting these barriers, from affordable to unhoused middle income housing. Justin, I think you really spoke well to this responsibility of the developer's approach to development as a public good. And something that I'm ruminating on is this idea that, you know, those folks, developers who really might be coming in with the community in mind, if they're the first in, they're having the biggest capital overtaking as the system is built right now. And then leading to Tom, I think you created this pathway of possibilities and showing how Sacramento recognized the need for rezoning so that communities can align on planning so that infrastructure needs are funded before development actually happens. And really wanted to just ground in that part of this is just making all the potential tools that we have available and pathways and possibilities that are there just really visible. And let's continue to have these conversations so that we can start to see the change in California that we need. So I'm closing this up today. Thanks again to Shalini, Justin, Mia, and Tom for joining us. And thanks to everyone else on the call for joining us as well. We'll be following up with a recording and an invite anyone interested in this topic to reach out to Build It Green. My email is both on the screen and it'll be dropped in the chat. And really hope y'all enjoyed this wonderful conversation. Thanks, y'all.